before I introduce the speaker, I would just say how lucky we are to have these speakers today and to hear from them. This year, 2021, is the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And these two people have been contributed a lot, and I can see them leader in the coming 10 years ahead of us for the protection and revival of ecosystem. So Julia Hedley is a retired librarian, and she has worked in the children's librarian domain system for many years. But in 2003, she bought a house in Sidney Island, and since then she has been involved in different ways. She has been part of the council and the committee, she has volunteered, but most importantly, she has worked a lot for the restoration of this beautiful, beautiful island. And she's currently the co-chair of the Ecological Stewardship Committee with Paul McNally. Paige Erickson-McGee grew up in Shawnigan Lake, and she has been enjoying since a really young age nature, walking around with her dog. After that, she was so inspired that she studied geography at UVic and then took an environmental technology and archaeological field training at Camosun. She's currently working for HAT as the Stewardship Coordinator, and two of her main projects are the Good Neighborhood Program and the Species at Risk Program. But not only works she's for HAT, in her spare time, she's the Pollinator Steward for the Haliburton Farm Urban Biodiversity Project and the co-chair of the Nature Plant Study Group. Thank you so much to this speaker to be here today, and then I'll leave the words to Julia and Paige.
Thanks so much. Sorry, I was hoping maybe Julia would start, because I think she really does such an amazing job of getting kind of the local insight. But Julia, are you comfortable doing that?
Sure, I'll start. I'm clicking on share screen, but it's not working.
Oh, sorry, I have to do that advanced, let people who can share, all participants. Okay, try one more time, it should let you.
Okay, there we go. Okay, my husband and I bought on Sidney Island in 2003, as Stephanie mentioned, and we were attracted to the natural beauty of the island. We love the forest, we love the rocky knolls, the beautiful sand beach, and I have to admit that we were also attracted by the hundreds of fallow deer. They were unique, and the fallow deer, as you know, are an invasive species, and they made their way to Sidney Island in the middle of the last century. And there were literally hundreds, if not thousands, of fallow deer on the island when we arrived. These sites were not unusual at all. These are in the Central Meadow. During the day, you were pretty much guaranteed that you would see fallow deer if you drove along the road by the Central Meadow or walked in that area. So the island was beautiful, but it wasn't long before we realized that there was something seriously wrong with this picture. Yes, the deer were a novelty, but they were actually destroying the island ecosystem. This is a picture of a protected area of vegetation and unprotected. And incredible though it is, the deer have browsed the vegetation outside this fence right down to the bare soil. And this is the kind of thing that we saw around the island at that time. This is a picture of the little pond that's at the north end of the airstrip. And across from Kingfisher Pond, the vegetation had been nibbled pretty extensively by the deer. We loved all the mature Gary oaks and we loved the arbutuses, but it didn't take us long to ask the question, well, where are all the juvenile trees coming along to replace these magnificent mature trees? Well, there were no juvenile trees or shrubs because the deer were browsing everything from the ground to as high as they could reach. So the only surviving juvenile trees were ones that had been planted under our forest management program and protected by plastic cones. The deer had damaged the ecosystem to the point that it was unable to regenerate. It lacked health, our forest lacked healthy understory, and the multitude of birds and species that one would expect to find in a thriving coastal Douglas fir ecosystem were either very scarce or missing altogether. So what to do? And various efforts were expended to control the deer population before we bought in 2003. But I'm going to concentrate on the time after 2003 because that's what I'm familiar with. So one of the ways that we've used to control the fallow deer is annual scheduled recreational hunting, in which owners are permitted to bring guests onto the island and to hunt, and there's no limit on the number of fallow deer that they can take. So recreational hunting was the only method that was being used to control the deer between 2003 and 2008. But in 2008, it became evident that the recreational hunting was not controlling the deer numbers. In fact, the population was increasing. So we added some more tools to our approach to deer control. We did capture culls. A capture cull is herding the deer using alfalfa food bait into a fenced area and then disposing of the deer. And I have to emphasize the fact that these capture culls are extraordinarily time consuming, and they were done by volunteers who contributed endless hours, night after night after night, closing gates. There was a lot of work that went into this. So 3 times around 2009, 10, 11, I think, a portable abattoir was brought to the island to process deer. There were enough deer that we could capture them, process them, sell the venison, and pay for this, the abattoir's services. Well, that worked for a few years, but when the deer numbers were reduced, it was no longer economically viable to bring the abattoir over to the island. So again, we reverted to doing these capture culls. Another technique that was used was professional cull hunting. A guiding company brought a team of hunters to hunt in a coordinated and intense way for about a week. And they were able to communicate with each other and move the deer into positions so they could more easily hunt them. And the professional cull hunting has proven very successful, and it was repeated for a number of years. So since 2008, 4,000 to 5,000 deer have been removed from the island. And if you go back as far as 1982, over 14,000 deer have been removed from the island. So in 2012, the Ecological Stewardship Committee was formed on Sidney Island. And the committee is made up of volunteers like me. We're not experts, we're amateurs. And so we routinely rely on experts to provide advice for our projects. Some of our members have taken continuing education courses at UVic in the area of ecological recovery and forest ecology, and what they've learned in these courses has informed the work of our committee as well. So what our committee is working toward is a balanced ecology, which includes the spontaneous regeneration of native vegetation. And our responsibilities include deer management, monitoring, forest management, and invasive species. Owners' engagement, I'm not going to talk about today. So the deer are obviously the major problem, the major threat to our ecosystem on the island. So I'm going to go back to deer management. It's very difficult to estimate numbers of deer. And common questions are, well, how many deer are there on the island? And how many deer could an island our size support? The second question is easier to answer than the first. The second question, experts have told us that an island our size could support a population of about 100 deer. The first question, how many deer are there on the island, is very tricky to answer. And experts have told us that it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to predict deer numbers. But one of our owners, Ken Poskett, has spent a lot of time and effort working on this question: how many deer are there? And he's prepared this graph, and I'd like to share it with you. So I would say from talking to Ken that if anybody can come close to estimating the population of deer on the island, it's probably Ken. He's done an incredible job here. So the dotted line that you see at the top of this graph is the estimation of the fallow deer population on Sidney Island, or the deer population. On the bottom, you see a number of bar graphs, and these graphs are indicative of data, real numbers that have been collected over this long period of time. So the time that's covered by this graph is 1981-82 to 2017-18. And you can see bars that are entirely green. You can see some that have some green, some red. You see bars with a little bit of blue on the bottom, and you see bars with some yellow to the right-hand side. So the green bars, exclusively green bars, represent years in which the only method used to control deer was recreational hunting. The bars that have red in them, the red represents capture culls that I described. The blue on the bottom of those bars in the middle, that is numbers of deer that were hunted on the park side of the island. And unfortunately, we don't have numbers that go from those middle years right up to the current time. So there is still hunting in the park every year, but we don't have the data to know how many deer have been taken in that way. The yellow that you see in the right-hand bars, the yellow represents the professional cull hunts that I mentioned. And then you can see on the right-hand side a little bit of orange on some of those bars. That is cougar. We had a cougar swim over to the island, and the cougar helped reduce deer numbers to some extent. So the interesting thing to take away from this graph is to look at the estimated population and how it responds to the methods that we're using. So if you see green bars and look at the dotted line up above, you will note that when we are only recreational hunting, the population of deer is increasing. So every time on that graph you see a reduction in the number of deer as that dotted line on the top, every time the curve is going down, we have employed at least one other technique besides the recreational hunting. So I think it's clear to say from this graph that historically hunting alone just has not done the trick. And this is why the park's proposal to eradicate the fallow deer as part of the restoration project is so very important. Eliminating fallow deer from our ecosystem is, in my opinion, the most significant step we could take if we want to have a healthy ecosystem. So given the difficulty of accurately predicting deer numbers, our committee, the Ecological Stewardship Committee, has decided to focus on vegetation recovery as a measure of deer control progress. And we have worked with Dr. Peter Arcese of UBC's Department of Forest and Conservation Science to set up a monitoring program on the island. And if you were listening to last week's presentation by Andrew McKinnon, he was emphasizing the importance of monitoring if you're working towards restoration. So every year, some of Peter Arcese's students are given the option to come to Sidney Island to conduct a vegetation monitoring study under his supervision. And this has happened a couple of times. It was interrupted by COVID last year, but the results of the work that the students have done have indicated that we do see some slight recovery of vegetation on the island, but we still have a very long way to go if we want to call our ecosystem a healthy ecosystem. So one of the other responsibilities of the Ecological Stewardship Committee is forest management. Our forest has been logged extensively a couple of times in the last century. Since logging, the forest has been really well managed. And so when logs are taken out of the forest, the areas are replanted and the trees are spaced and pruned, and occasional thinning happens, or logging, it happens regularly. This is a picture of thinning done on the left-hand side is thinning done in 2013, and on the right-hand side, you can see the same area in 2018, looking much more aesthetically pleasing. And but if you look at that picture, you will see that the forest we have, the resulting forest, is made up generally of uniform stands of trees with a closed canopy, very little diversity, and almost no understory. And you can see salal here. Deer don't like salal, so we have lots of salal on Sidney Island, but there is very little understory diversity. The deer have browsed any understory that might have been there, with the exception of the salal. This year, we're going to change our approach slightly to forestry. We're going to try something new. We're going to create some microcuts, which are patches in the forest where not all, but most of the trees are removed. And the purpose of doing this is to open up the canopy and give us a chance to plant in those microcut areas for diversity and reintroduce some of the things that are missing in the forest. So Parks for the Forest project has committed to building some exclosures on our side of the fence. And our plan is to use these microcut patches and a few other locations to provide spots for these fence exclosures, which will be planted with a variety of species, the woody shrubs and deciduous trees that the island is lacking. And we're looking forward to First Nations suggestions as to plants that we can include in these exclosures, because they have expressed an interest in including plants that are significant to them culturally in terms of food and medicine sources. So if we can improve the diversity in our forest, the result should be improved animal habitat, improved forest health, and it should contribute to resilience to climate change. So another area of concern for our committee is invasive species. And we've certainly discovered the downside of reducing deer numbers. When we reduce deer numbers, invasive species spread rapidly. And so we have a lot of hawthorn and broom, and we're noticing a lot more holly on the island now. Both the hawthorn and the broom were very effectively browsed by deer, but now they're getting release. So this picture here is a picture of our central meadow. And the meadow area in the middle of our island is about 34 hectares. Not only is it a lovely open space with an airstrip on one side of it, it does have cultural and historical significance. There's evidence along the edge of this meadow, burn scars on tree trunks that are evidence that this meadow area was used by indigenous populations to cultivate food sources, probably camas and other types of food. So the meadow is very old, probably a natural meadow, and we would like to preserve it. Bottom line, we would like to keep it an open meadow. So we've been kind of tackling this hawthorn problem, trying to figure out a way to deal with it for a number of years now. We've tested various methods trying to get rid of the hawthorn, including mowing the meadow, cutting trees and drilling holes in the remaining stumps and filling those with borax. We've injected trunks with pellets of Roundup. We've yanked trees out of the ground with an excavator. And the results of all these methods have been fairly mixed. So again, Parks for the Forest initiative, and are involved in the planning of that, has given us the opportunity to participate in a parks funded study involving cutting hawthorn and treating the stumps with Garlon, a chemical, and also painting the bark of some of the younger hawthorn trees with Garlon to see what the results were. Well, the Garlon treatment seems to work, and we've discovered that our excavator removal technique seems to work as well. And we've decided that on our side of the island, we would prefer to use the excavator. I think it's more efficient. It gets rid of it pulls the tree at roots, and also you don't end up with a lot of stumps. And so later in this year, Parks has agreed to fund the removal of a large number of trees with an excavator as part of the forest restoration plan. This will give a sense, when we do some of it, it'll give us a sense of how much time and money it would take to remove most of the mature hawthorn from the area around the meadow. We'd also like to control the broom, which has spread dramatically in the last few years. There was an effort last year to have a broom control weekend involving owners, but unfortunately it was interfered with by COVID. But this year, our committee had a little bit of money in the budget to dedicate to broom removal. And so the silviculture crew that we had on the island have removed broom from a patch at the southwest corner of the meadow. And they're using a technique that we're trying out, which is to plant the area with red alder trees. The idea is that the alder trees will grow very fast. They will shade the area that the broom plants would have been seeding, and they'll prevent those seeds from taking root and growing. This is a technique that our silviculture contractor has used successfully in other places, and we're hoping that it can help control some of the broom on our island as well. So we do see, by the way, this is what hawthorn looks like when the deer have been browsing it for years and years, and then the top of it is the release. When the deer numbers go down, then we get this little hawthorn popping out of the top of it. So we do see some signs of recovery on the island. On the left side, you can see a camas that appeared a few years ago on the south end of the island. And we were so excited to see it that we protected it with wire. On the right-hand side, this is with no wire protection. We're now getting this kind of view in the spring, and this is more camas on the south end of the island. We're seeing some recruitment of Douglas fir and cedar and other kinds of trees on the island. They're managing to spring up on their own. I must say, I see very little in the way of arbutus and Gary oak. They pop up in the spring, but I don't see evidence that they're surviving through the whole beyond one season. This is the pond that I showed you earlier on the left-hand side, severely browsed by the deer, and this is what it looks like today with all that vegetation on the right-hand side. This is sword ferns that you can see growing on the forest floor, and we hadn't seen sword ferns growing on Sidney Island in the forest for a number of years. We probably saw them starting about maybe 3 or 4 years ago. This is an exposure that's on the south side of the island, and just to indicate that yes, we have some recovery, but this picture was taken either last year or the year before, and you can see there's still a dramatic difference between the inside and the outside. The inside has a lot more lush green vegetation, and the deer are doing still a pretty good job of efficiently mowing the grass on the outside of these exclosures. This is our forest, the beautiful forest, and I think this is a gorgeous picture. Thank you, Keith Purchase, for this picture. But again, Salal is there, but there's virtually no shrubbery or healthy understory. This is Portland Island. Portland Island has no deer, and I would say this is a picture of a healthy forest. You can see age diversity, you can see species diversity, you can see coniferous trees and deciduous trees, you can see healthy understory, lots of different shrubs and ferns. And we'll probably have deer on Sidney Island always, so it probably won't ever look quite like this on Sidney Island, but my hope is that at some point it might look more like this. I'd just like to say in conclusion that the Parks Forest Restoration Project has given us a lot of opportunity. Parks planning and expertise and funding gives us the chance to engage in recovery initiatives that we have been on our wish list, but now we can translate that wish list into some action. And the projects perfectly complement the goal of our Ecological Stewardship Committee, which is to promote and maintain a healthy ecosystem. The Vegetation Working Group has been meeting regularly and has identified 2 island-wide initiatives. One is managing invasive species, specifically hawthorn, and I've described how we are going to start removing hawthorn with an excavator shortly. And the second part of the second initiative that the Vegetation Working Group has identified is introducing diversity by way of planting in exclosures. And these are feasible, doable projects that we can do over the next 3 years. We're in the process of fine-tuning the plans for these recovery projects with parks, and we're very grateful that they are going to be funding them. So thank you.
I'm trying to unmute Bea here, but it might take her a second.
Yes.
There we go, Bea.
Thank you, Julia. This is an amazing presentation, and the pictures are really breathtaking. I think now, Paige, maybe you want to weigh in and help talk more about native plants and also native plants gardening, because we know that this is also part of an important piece of the restoration, is being really aware and willing to plant the right species in the right spots, which you taught me a while ago, and I'm still so bad at it. So please, Paige, help us out.
Sure, absolutely. Oh, well, thanks so much for having me, everybody. And it's nice to be here, back. I did get to visit Sidney Island once before, and Julia had invited me and Parks Canada to do a in-person demo. And so it's nice to see some familiar faces and to be back here. So it was wonderful to see Julia's photos, see how things have evolved over time. It's been a number of years. So I did want to jump off from what she had started, really talking about what it means to be a habitat steward, talk a little bit about native plant gardening, and a little bit about invasive species. And we'll also sort of chat as well, give some time for questions. Got a lot of info, so we might not get to it all, but I will provide it as a PDF so folks can read it later and look at the details and things. So we'll see what we do. Okay, I'm gonna try to share my screen here, and we will get started. So you'll probably see, got this thing, it's not quite presented yet, so let's do that for you. So if you aren't familiar, oh, can you see it now? Okay, I see some nodding, excellent. So this is about how to be a good neighbor to nature on Sidney Island, and we're going to go through a couple examples as well of some ideas of what might be good projects to start with if you're new to the concept or if you're a seasoned steward. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about who I am. If you don't know me, what is HAT and what is, maybe habitat, ideas for stewardship. I'm going to give a case study example, and I'd love to hear a little bit about what's either on your land or questions you might have. So Bea did a great job introducing me, so I won't have to say it again, but I have taken on yet another hat of working at Saanich Native Plants Nursery and consulting, because my nerding passion is plants. So that's where I've been heading. And the last one on the list is Project Reclaim, which is a project out of the Sartlet Nation, part of the Wasanic community, and that is restoring native habitats with Bianca Elliott. So that's been a lot of fun too. And if you aren't familiar with HAT, we're the land trust for just the CRD, so including the Southern Gulf Islands and Sidney Island. We work to protect and restore land, teach residents all about stewardship, and especially wildlife. We do work with kids and lots of partnering with community groups as well. So what are habitats to us? Well, it can be a big range, really, but when we talk about habitats for humans, like where do we cohabitate or where are we living, it's, you know, the factors of, you know, food, energy, our house in general is what we think of in habitat. But for other communities that we live here with, it can be, you know, culture, it can be a source of income, lots of, you know, fishing and all kinds of recreation from kayaking, swimming. And then in terms of wildlife, you know, we're all utilizing this space, sustain resources. And so when we think about the coast and islands like Sidney Island, looking at, you know, for wildlife, foraging habitat, which is, you know, the food, nesting, obviously, which would be, you know, raising their young, and then just places to live, enough space to live. So thinking about habitat from those perspectives and how can we offer those features beyond just our own needs. So a lot of folks wonder if their, you know, little backyard can really make a difference. And I always say, yes, absolutely. So we're going to try and start with the how. How do you do it? Well, you don't have to be a habitat steward, that's for sure, but you absolutely can be, and we'd happily encourage that. Essentially, a habitat steward is learning how to care for the land in ways that provide habitat for other creatures besides themselves, from plant to animal, and other humans in addition. So our habitat stewards, if you see somebody, a resident, with this sign maybe at the end of their driveway, it means they've committed in writing to working on 5 practices. And the 5 practices, I have more information about them on the next slide here. So they want to care for those natural habitats, and they do that through planting native plants or naturescaping, as Julia had talked a little bit about. Removing invasive plants, that's going to be an increasingly more prevalent action to take with less deer. Maintaining and creating wildlife habitat. If you've got habitat there, that's fantastic. Starting to look at what that looks like over time as the landscape and the ecosystems rebuild and regenerate. And then being watershed wise, that just means being kind to, you know, what goes, being mindful about what goes down your drains, what goes, you know, if there's septic or going into the ocean, cleaning, compost piles, all those things, you know, are we being mindful of that? Transitioning into the marine environment. As we said, you know, the marine environment is a source of income for our communities, and so we need to also maintain that habitat for wildlife. And then the last one is spreading the word and further learning. So we have all kinds of resources, and one of these webinars, you know, would be a great example of doing that. So I wanted to give you the case study of our habitat steward, Andy McKinnon. Was he a speaker last week? Oh, there you go. And you get the inside scoop on Andy's place. Andy lives just above Whitty's Beach, Whitty's Lagoon area, and has this slope that has been eroding. It is a natural geomorphic process, so it's not a surprise, but doing his best to you know, slow down that process if he can, but also provide habitat in the meantime as that happens. So we wanted to look at sort of some of those stewardship steps. So what is he doing on his land that can provide habitat, while also sort of addressing a concern that he had, which was erosion. So he had volunteers and himself, he'd been removing lots of blackberry, daphne, ivy, and broom on the slope, carefully, of course, to ensure it doesn't erode away. And then he decided to replace those with native ferns, shrubs, and sedges. wildlife habitat. He had some standing dead trees he wanted to ensure stayed there instead of cutting them to the ground. So allowing, 8 or 10 feet to stay. The woodpeckers would use them. Planting berry producing shrubs, not sort of cleaning up all the mulch and leaves, because those provide excellent habitat for butterflies that lay their eggs on leaves, and then also just sort of keeping it messy for all those little cracks and crevices, sticks and pieces of wood. All that provides great habitat. And then he also looked at watershed protection, obviously being right by the ocean, wanting to make sure he has a well-functioning septic system that's cleaned regularly and up to code, and not using any kind of pesticides for just general, lawn use, that kind of thing. Same with FOG is fats, oils, and greases. So that's not letting those things down the drain, causing problems, or any medications, obviously. And then efficient watering. He used hand watering because he had a small site, but drip irrigation or, on a timer, that kind of thing, if we can do our best. And then he attended a pollinator workshop to learn more. So with his plantings, this is sort of an example of what it looked like after he put in a lot of the other plantings, more of those ferns, ocean spray, and other shrubs to kind of get much more shrub habitat, but also less of the, both the shade and less of the invasive plants, and a little bit more slope stability, which is great. And I just liked the quote that he said, backyard stewardship is a significant in the community, because if you value shoreline for recreation and nature-based learning potential, it's got an importance for fishery and the food chain alike. It's a relief to know that it is being looked after by a friendly upshore neighbor. And that's the idea of the Good Neighbors program. And you don't have to be a good neighbor, but you can be a good neighbor to nature regardless. And it does make a huge difference to the other folks, on the island. I think that applies well in a small community like that. So part of what we hope is, when you have those good neighbors, you start to create this network of stewards. You've got an empowered community, you've got the scientific research to back up your decisions, and a strength in numbers. So you're creating a wonderful habitat corridor for the wildlife and native plants, and rebuilding that ecosystem. So where can you start? It's kind of a big question, but there are all kinds of ways you can participate in stewardship. These are just a few examples, but one of them I thought I'd talk about today is the backyard stewardship aspect. So these are some examples that I thought we'd touch on today. Where to start? Ecological restoration can be a head scratcher sometimes, but it doesn't have to be too challenging for you. So we'll touch on naturescaping, invasive plants, and wildlife enhancement. Naturescaping, oops, sorry, you get to see my backyard here, is the focus of using native plants in your gardening. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but we do recommend, starting in small sections if you haven't done it before, because it does help. You can test out what grows well in your site. Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to find what will do well. And you can try little patches or strips. You can try a hedgerow, that's an example. We do recommend planting a variety of bloom types, and that can be smaller flowers, different patterns, different shapes and sizes, and as well as bloom times, especially for pollinators. Having that longer bloom time from February right into October is doable in this area, and I think it's kind of a nice way to see those for myself as well. And then things to consider about your site would be what kind of soil or drainage you have, kind of light, throughout the day, how much light and where is it coming from? And then the moisture of the soil too. Is it, soaking wet all winter and dry in the summer? thinking about that. And then removing invasive plants would be a great place to start if you have some in an area, and then replacing them with native plants sooner rather than later can kind of help with a few things, and I'll get to that as well. Oh, and I was just going to say, this is a resource on the top corner, selecting plants for pollinators. It's for the Eastern Vancouver Island ecoregion, which includes sort of Sydney as well. So I think it would be totally applicable to Sidney Island. So this is an example of my garden where I wanted to turn some of this lawn, and it was partial sun, and what I did was I put down some cardboard and put some oak leaf mulch on top, and then bordered it with just some fallen sticks from my backyard, some branches, and then I planted some things right in there, some grasses and some wildflower seed and pots. And then that was all done in the fall, kind of September, October. And then I actually seeded some wildflower seeds right in between all of that. And these are all little oak seedlings that came in through the oak leaf mulch that I had. I didn't even have oaks on my property. I just grabbed some from the neighbor's pile. They thought I was very strange stealing their leaves, but they were fine with it. Just a strange action, I guess. And then this was the next year. So just in the first year, I got to see so much sea blush, which was so exciting for me. This was my first attempt. And then I had the Western buttercup and quite a bit of the blue-eyed Mary, some nice Romer's fescue grass in the bottom here. And then I put pots of shrubs around because I wasn't sure if the deer were going to munch them. So I just put them in pots, and it worked out really well, and it stayed, you know, similar, sort of evolved, different plants flowering each season or each year, but it got to see that the first year. So you can get a pretty nice result that first time. The deer didn't seem to like it, but can't speak for your deer, fallow deer population. If you're interested in sort of the impact of pollinators and wild plants, and maybe which ones might be great for bees, and you're interested in bees, I'd recommend checking out Elizabeth Ellie and her SFU lab. She has done tons of research on this, and specifically with the Garry Oak ecosystem and what kinds of bees visited what kinds of native plants. And so I didn't realize the top 3 plants were common camas, great camas, and snowberry, which was kind of cool, and saw way more individuals visiting those species than others. They're looking at the 400 individuals, whereas the sea blush is number 4, and it was seeing 55. So just amazing that camas is sort of the top cheese for bees, but you can learn more about that, and there's lots of great resources on both the Saanich Native Plants website and Pollinator Partnership Canada about that. Other native plants for bees and other wildlife, I mentioned that long season bloom. So early ones, there's some examples there. Spring gold has already been blooming for a couple of weeks. And then mid-season, we're kind of getting close to this one now, sea blush and those ones listed there. And if you're interested in late blooming ones, entire-leaved gumweed is one that blooms into October and is a really beautiful yellow beach sunflower that might go well on Sidney Island. But you'll have this one after the presentation too. Oh yes, this is to remind me to mention that if you're thinking about pollinators and you're wanting to benefit wildlife, it's good to think about both nectaring plants and larval host plants. Butterflies need to lay their eggs on something, and their caterpillars need to eat. eat something. And they do actually. Our native butterflies have a very specific diet and needs when it comes to the larval host plants. That's what we call them. And one of those is actually a favorite is stinging nettle, believe it or not. That one is, there are 5 species of butterflies that will lay their eggs on stinging nettle, and 3 of them will only lay their eggs on stinging nettle. So it's, believe it or not, probably one of the best butterfly plants out there. And just being aware that, you know, gotta get both the egg laying and the nectaring ones. So for invasive removal, I just wanted to mention, you know, invasive, I won't go into the details about what they are, but we do have this resource on how to get started with invasive plants in your garden or just in your community. This is sort of a nice introductory guide. It's available for free on our website, and it talks a little bit more about some individual species and what kinds of techniques have been successful for folks in research. And it's so nice to hear from Julia what some of the results are in your community as well, because that all adds to the, you know, collective knowledge of what's going on. Some folks don't realize there are so many ways invasive plants can travel, and that holly, you know, might be showing up in places that it hadn't before. And sometimes that, you know, that could be birds, you know, different birds visiting perhaps. You know, if we're creating more shrubs, that usually means there's more habitat for songbirds, which means they're visiting more. So if, you know, making assumptions, but that could be something that that impacts what we're seeing on the landscape. I won't go into the impacts of invasive species, but you know, they do have some pretty substantial impacts on the environment. And this is a photo at Power to Be. They have a property at Prospect Lake, and we were chatting with them about what happens if you leave a pile of broom on the ground like that, and nothing seems to want to grow up in there after, except invasive species. So leaving it on the land can sometimes, just being mindful of that when you're removing in sensitive spaces. And in sort of the same vein, if we're looking at invasive impacts culturally, if these plants are lost, and I think Julia mentioned there was interest in getting native plants that could be utilized by the Wasanich communities. This is, you know, it's an example of, you know, we're losing those culturally important plants, and what can we do to improve that? Invasive plants can take up a lot of space. And I wanted to give an example. I think some folks say, oh, but you know, I see birds visiting the holly or birds eating the blackberries, and so therefore it must be bird habitat. But there actually has been some good research that came out of Vancouver quite a while ago now, and saw that in blackberry thickets there weren't as many species, bird species that used that habitat, especially ones that were kind of specific. They like to visit only certain native shrubs, and so you never saw those bird species in those blackberry thickets. And you also saw a lot more invasive shrubs or invasive animals like squirrels, raccoons, rats, because they like to live in that sort of brambly habitat, feral cats, that kind of thing. And so that meant that they were low nest predators, and they would eat those sort of shrub loving birds that we love to see, which is unfortunate. So it just meant that, you know, there wasn't as much biodiversity, and they weren't providing habitat for very many types of birds. So you're seeing almost twice as many bird species use the native shrubs, lots of those specialist birds as well. You can read more about that. Just some tips and tricks. So if you have a lot of invasive plants, usually we recommend creating a little map of your backyard or of your neighborhood. It's kind of a fun way to get a better sense, an overview sense of what you've got. You can draw it yourself or go online and check it out. Go by sections, going slow is okay. Usually we recommend to start at the edges and work into the most dense areas last. And try to get those outliers first. And then disposal, you can find out more at this new CRD invasive page that's listed there. A couple other ones, would definitely recommend to remove plants before they flower. Do try to minimize soil disturbance. Now this depends on the species. But if the shrub has dropped a lot of seed in the past, then digging up the soil might mean you're digging up a lot of seed. And so you're kind of creating that perfect opportunity for all those seeds to germinate. So if you can, and if this, the situation allows to minimize that by cutting, and that can be good, but again, it does depend. And then peek over your fence, meaning, keep an eye out for where it might be coming from. It might be coming from a neighbor's property, and it's a good opportunity to engage them about, stewardship and in the community. And so there's a couple more questions. I did want to pause a little bit just in case we wanted to stop for questions, and I can see Stephanie has a great note there about, oh, do you want to pop in?
Maybe I will. I'll jump in just for a second. So the meeting was originally scheduled till 1. It's okay that we're running long, but just in case anyone has any burning questions they really want to ask, but they have to leave at 1, feel free to drop them in the chat here or do the raise hands, and I'll try to get to anyone who has to vacate quickly.
Nice. Yes, if there's any questions, feel free to pop in. I'll happily just keep chit-chatting about plants for another 5 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I don't see anything immediately, so why don't you go ahead, Paige, and I'll just keep my eye out here to see if anything pops up.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So these are just some resources and examples of ways, to continue to spread the word. And if you can, talk to your nursery about being plant-wise. A couple of other habitat steward examples I'll just mention are wildlife enhancements. And so some of these will be familiar to you, but maybe not to everybody. And we have an example of a bat box. And so this one is a rocket box on the left and a maternity box on the right. And that's kind of all about creating summer roosting habitat for female bats that have a pup, and they're raising their 1 pup a year, and they do that in the summer. And so rather than having them in your house, you can have them in a bat box. And I'd be happy to chat by email or further about if you have a site that might be suitable. Same goes for birds. So just again, being aware of who you're creating habitat for. We can sometimes accidentally create habitat for invasive birds, which can be challenging. So starlings would be an example, but this is, there's a couple of nice notes. So this is an example of trying to create a nest box for the swallows, and wanting to use this different kind of hole cover to prevent the invasive birds from getting in. So that would be an example of just a easy modification we can make, and there's more details on that link below. And you can buy these as well from Wild Birds Unlimited in Victoria here, these little hole covers. And then bees as well. I could talk for days about bees, but I'll just say that You can do different structures like mason bees boxes, but I will say mason bees are an awesome little project for learning, but our mason bees aren't, you know, struggling at all. So it's a fantastic way to learn about bees, but they do take some maintenance and effort, like bird boxes. They need to be cleaned out and maintained. And there's more information on that link. So if you want to take that on, it's a little bit more work, but it is a lot of fun. And this is, I mentioned, maintenance required, so cleaning the cocoons and the boxes themselves every year. You get to see bees up close, which is cool. And they're very harmless, these ones, so love that. We did get that question, you know, should I get honeybees to save the bees? Honeybees are the weirdos, but it's sort of, honeybees are a wonderful commodity, an agricultural product that is delicious, and I love honey, but we don't have native honeybees here, so they are not going to save the bees. We have lots of native bees that need desperate help. We'll focus on those instead, unless you just want it for the honey. And I've got a few slides here about bees, and I'll leave them in there because you can take a look at a later date, you know, what's going on with the bees, why are they what they are. European honeybees are a fantastic creature to learn about because they're oddballs compared to all the native ones that are mostly not managed, and they're solitary, and many of them actually live in the ground. So very unusual to most of our, compared to most of our bees. So for example, you know, we wanted folks to think about these different ways they can help bees, but also just nature in general. You know, there's all kinds of spaces. It doesn't have to be big, huge natural parks. You can have little tiny garden patches, backyard stuff, right of ways, you know, your beautiful central meadow that you folks have on your island. What an amazing place to start thinking about stewardship. And I think I'll stop there because you folks have well, there's so much to talk about, but I'll leave it in a slide book for you to take a look at a later date.